you. Just have a few notes here I'm trying to find. And I couldn't find them, so it's okay. This is not, first of all, I'm delighted to be back in New York. I'm delighted to be speaking at the American Museum of Natural History. I don't think I've spoken here for maybe 15 or so years, maybe more. I remember speaking here in the 1980s, 1987 maybe. But I'm delighted to be back here. And you may have noticed that I have changed the title of my talk to Why Are There No Orangutans or Monkeys or Apes in Australia? And I'm a little bit nervous as I stand here. And the reason I'm nervous is because I have never academically studied or much thought about Alfred Russel Wallace or Darwin. I think the reason that I was invited to speak here is because Alfred Russel Wallace, despite his natural empathy for people and his mildness and his humility, was, in my mind, a murderer. And the individuals that he murdered were orangutans. Now, you may not agree with me that this was murder, but to many people, including many Indonesians, killing orangutans is murder. And the reason it's murder is because orangutans are so much like people that the original name for orangutans, orang-hutan, in the Malay language means people or person of the forest. And the local Aboriginal people, including the Dayaks, of whom Wallace thought so highly of, called them that because they believed that, like people, they could actually speak, but they preferred not to because then they would have to go and work. And they preferred to stay in the forest and sleep in the canopies of the rainforest and eat the lush, sweet fruit that the rainforest canopies provided. So I'm not an expert on Alfred Russel Wallace. I'm not an expert on Darwin, and perhaps my views might be a tiny bit idiosyncratic. But I started thinking about Alfred Russel Wallace and why he killed so many orangutans. And as I was listening to the talks this morning and this afternoon, I noticed that some of the things that were said were very much in accordance with what I had read, of course, and what my own views came to be. And that is that the slaughter that Wallace participated in was slaughter for the sake of specimens. And specimens, of course, in Victorian times meant money. And this was very well illustrated, very well described by a previous speaker. So, unlike Darwin, Wallace did not come from a wealthy family that was connected to the Wedgwood fortune or what have you. Unlike Wallace, Darwin did not have to quit school at the age of 13. I think Darwin initially started studying to become a clergy person, university, and then changed his mind. And he did not have to work as a surveyor. And I think the previous speaker laid out a very good case for the fact that Wallace's experience as a surveyor led him down the productive paths that he followed. And so Wallace was a person of the field. Wallace was basically a person of the working class. He worked at a variety of trades, and all these trades seemed to have something to do with the hands, with skills in the field. So he was not an academic in any sense of the word, except, of course, in later life. And at the age of 25, he was able, through his own efforts, which involved meeting a fellow naturalist by the name of Bates, to go travel in the Amazon. And the way that I think of it, perhaps other people don't think of it this way, is that his travels in the Amazon basically were a practice for what happened later on when he went to Southeast Asia. And when he traveled in the Amazon, he went up the Rio Negro, which is a tributary of the Amazon. And it's also one of the rivers, the largest river in the world, that is called a blackwater river. There's a very particular kind of ecology. And the reason that I'm aware of this is because I study orangutans in Indonesian Borneo and Kalimantan Tengah, the province of central Indonesian Borneo, on a river that is called the Sequoia. It's a very small river, nothing like the Rio Negro. But like the Rio Negro, it is also a black water river. Well, Wallace's life was full of dire adventure. And on the way home, again, as another speaker explained, he was shipwrecked and most of his specimens went down. So when he arrived in England, he basically had very little to show for his trip up the Rio Negro. But he did write about his travels, and I'm sure that his travels on the Rio Negro prepared him in a very deep way for what happened next. And that is his travels to the Malay Archipelago. The Malay Archipelago in the 19th century was ruled by the Dutch, basically. What we now know as Indonesia was basically Dutch. The Philippines, I believe, was a Spanish colony. Somebody mentioned about the previous speaker actually mentioned pirates in Borneo or in the region around Borneo. And actually, those pirates came from the Philippines. And they would make these long circum-Borneo voyages. They would be like, fleets of ships tied together. And those were very dangerous seas in those times. And the power of the Philippine pirates was actually broken by the American Navy. Sort of an interesting little fact. So those were dangerous times, those were dangerous areas, and it is to Alfred Russel Wallace's credit that he made the expeditions that he did. His natural empathy with humans came into play because he met Sir James Brooke. And Sir James Brooke is one of these fascinating characters that exists on the edge of world history, global history. And who was Sir James Brooke? He was an English adventurer. And with one ship, he conquered Sarawak, which at the time was the land base of operations for the so-called Sea Dayaks. The Sea Dayaks were also pirates, but unlike the Filipino pirates, they didn't venture very far from land. But in their huge dugout canoes, they traveled the coasts of Borneo, taking heads. They were particularly militaristic in that way. It was said that the Iban, who were one of the Sea Dayaks, and the main Sea Dayaks, were so addicted to taking heads that it was like Americans addicted to their coffee. They even dug up graves to get heads. Well, Sir James Brooke conquered them, and he became the only English adventurer in history to become the absolute ruler, the king, or a Raja of his own domain. And for almost 100 years, the Brookes, they were a dynasty, a nephew and then the son of the nephew, who ruled Sarawak, tried to give Sarawak away to Great Britain as a colony. Now, whatever we think about colonialism, we have to remember that the British didn't want Sarawak. The British Parliament absolutely refused to take it, and it wasn't until after the Second World War that the last of the Brookes refused to leave his English country cottage, where he had found refuge during the Second World War, and just said to Great Britain, take it or leave it. And so they took it, and then they gave it away to the Malaysian Federation. So I'm telling you the story to demonstrate how important Wallace's relationship with Sir James Brooke was. Because when Wallace traveled, he traveled under very horrific conditions, sort of like a backpacker would travel across Borneo today, just taking a tent and, what he or she has in his or her backpack. But after he finished his travels, he would return to the palace, or the nice house, of Sir James Brooke. And the support of James Brooke should not be underestimated in understanding the travels of Wallace during this period. Wallace was very much taken by Sir James Brooke, and he even named one of the most beautiful of the butterflies that he collected, the Raja's birdwing, in honor of Brooke. So, why did Wallace murder so many orangutans? It makes painful reading of the book, The Malay Archipelago, to read his chapter on orangutans. He personally killed 17 of them. 17. And they didn't die easily. He didn't kill them easily. There was, of those 17 orangutans, only one was killed with one shot. Most of them clung tenaciously to life. Most of them kept moving. Most of them kept hiding, even after they had been shot. And I'd like to read you something from Malay Archipelago. I have it right here. And he just killed or badly wounded one particular orangutan. And so this orangutan falls to the ground. And this is what Wallace says. On examination, we found the orangutan had been dreadfully wounded. Both legs were broken. One hip joint and the root of the spine completely shattered, and 2 bullets were found flattened in his neck and jaws. Yet he was still alive when he fell. And this was typical. I mean, this is not the most gruesome illustration of how dreadful these killings were. And he had to pay local people sometimes to climb up and get the bodies down. Sometimes he actually left the killed orangutan in the fork of a tree and moved on, saying it wasn't valuable enough, especially if it was that of a juvenile, to get and skin and bring back to England. So why did he do this? Well, he did this, as several speakers have made very clear, because Wallace was poor. Wallace did not come from a wealthy family. Wallace never in his entire life had full-time employment. Wallace was also always seeking such employment. He was always looking for specimens because he needed to keep himself alive. He needed to survive. And most of the 17 orangutans that he did kill did go to museums or were bought by museums in England, and he boasts about it. He tells us where each particular skeleton went, except for the ones that he left behind because he didn't think they were much value. So this is actually a very dreadful story, and it's very indicative of Victorian attitudes, probably not just to orangutans, but also to human beings. We all know of the famous Hottentot woman whose body was displayed for many years in one of the museums in Paris. So it tells you how far we have actually progressed. And it also tells me that, again, I know very little about all this, but it tells me that Wallace was very much a man of his time and of his Victorian age. It also tells me, in contrast, for a variety of reasons, that Darwin perhaps was different. Perhaps Darwin's serenity And the way that Darwin looked at the world came from his particular background in British society. Again, I'm not an expert on the class system in Great Britain, but there's a contrast between these two men that goes very, very deep. Now, humans don't like randomness. Humans like to see patterns where no such patterns exist. Humans try to find meaning or give meaning to events, and sometimes those meanings are not warranted. So I tried to find meaning. I tried to find a pattern in why Wallace killed orangutans. And much to my disappointment, I really was not able to give much meaning to it. Now, Wallace's knowledge of orangutans was quite exquisite. He got most things right. And until people like John McKinnon in the 1960s went to study orangutans in Sumatra and Borneo, the best knowledge that we actually had of orangutans was from the writings of Wallace. And it's very true. Orangutans were and are very difficult to study. George Schaller tried to study orangutans and found himself walking, up to his chest in peat swamp forests, that flowed into the South China Sea, and basically didn't add much to the knowledge that Wallace provided. There were Japanese primatologists. There was an American primatologist who studied them, I believe, for 9 or 10 months. So orangutans are difficult to study. You have to find an ideal location, and you have to be tenacious, and you have to be disciplined. Orangutans, I thought, might be of special interest to Wallace because they're one of our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. They're not as close to us as chimpanzees are. Chimpanzees are so close that we can actually get a blood transfusion from them, and vice versa. And I like to say, and it happens, people do get blood transfusions, and one of the reasons that they might get a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee is while having their blood washed. It's happened. I've read about it. And I've often thought that Keith Richards, who gets his blood washed often, might have chimpanzee blood in him. But the point is that you can't get a blood transfusion from an orangutan, and neither can an orangutan get a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee once blood groups are matched. So orangutans are fairly close to us. They share 97% of their genetic material with us. And I thought in my reading that I would find in Alfred Russel Wallace some deeper understanding of this relationship between humans and orangutans. But alas, it was not to be. Wallace did take care of an orangutan infant for 3 months, and the infant did die from a lack of milk. He was not able to procure milk. So the orangutan infants stay with their mothers from 5 to 10 years, depending on their location. In East Borneo, they often spend 5 to 5.5 years with their mothers, up to 6 years. In central Indonesian Borneo, where I work, they might spend 8 years, first 8 years of their lives with their mother. And in Sumatra, they might spend 10 or 11 years with their mother. Can't call them infants by then because they're pretty big, but they don't leave their mothers until they might be 10 or 11, and they might suckle her for almost as long. So what Wallace did know about orangutans was almost entirely correct. He did note that they were solitary or semi-solitary, that they were usually encountered alone when he killed them. And one of the females that he killed, after she fell to the ground, actually into the swamp, when they brought out her body from the water, they discovered that there was a little tiny infant clinging to her stomach. And this tiny little infant could not have been more than 1 or 2 months of age. And like I said, Wallace took care of the infant for about 3 months, and the infant gave him a large amount of amusement. And he carried the infant, he bathed the infant, and he had some very detailed, as was his fashion, observations on the infant. And you can see how cute orangutan infants are, which is one of the reasons why people like to keep, or used to like to keep them as pets in Indonesia and Malaysia. Orangutan infants cling to their mothers until they're about 5 years of age. That's the minimum. They'll cling to their mothers. And when they move from tree to tree. And Wallace took some joy in having the infant, an annoyance, in having the infant clinging to his beard. The infant preferred to cling to his beard. Well, the hairiest part of his body that he could access anyways, he or she could access. So the main mistake that I have found, there could be others, in Wallace's appreciation of orangutans is he said they knuckle walked. And indeed, orangutans do not knuckle walk, but the chimpanzees, gorillas, and bonobos, who are the African apes, do have a secondary adaptation to terrestrial locomotion in that their wrists are have special sort of features that enable them to knuckle walk very efficiently. So I mentioned the fact that Wallace had a very close and good and warm relationship with James Brooke, the White Raja of Sarawak. And this was one of the papers that came out that was important in the history of our understanding of evolution. It came out in 1855, well, as a result of a stay in Sarawak. And at this point, Wallace was still referring to the divergences in the patterns of species as creations, an indication that he as yet had no grasp of the actual process of evolution. And Darwin responded to this paper by saying nothing very new. And it was as a response to Wallace's so-called Sarawak Law that Darwin began what became his draft for a book titled Natural Selection. And eventually, the book that electrified the world on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Well, Wallace hadn't yet come up with the idea of natural selection. But while staying in East Indonesia, what is now Eastern Indonesia, a place called Ternate, whatever, he had a high fever. Now, people have referred to this high fever here at this, I guess, symposium or whatever, as malarial. We're not sure that it was malarial. It could have been dengue. It could have actually been something else. But there's a likelihood that it could have been malarial. I tend to think it might have been dengue. I've had malaria and I've had dengue. So these cold and succeeding hot fits also are characteristic of dengue. Dengue is a horrific, horrible disease. And what happens during it, and this is during the very dangerous portion of it, is after 3 days, you're so weak. It's also called bone break fever. You can't get up. You're shivering with the cold. And suddenly, you're transported into ecstasy. And you start dancing around. I literally was dancing around, my house in Borneo, in Kalimantan. And there's some strange physiological thing happens in the body, and that's when you die. When you come down from that ecstasy, you come down from that feeling of whatever it is. It's an extraordinary feeling. I still remember exactly what it was like. And I'm sure that people take drugs to duplicate that kind of feeling. It was just ecstasy. It was just the world just seemed bright. The colors seemed clearer. Everything was vibrant. Everything was happy, joyous. And then, of course, for the next month afterwards, I could scarcely get out of bed. So during one of these fevers, dengue, malarial, whatever, Wallace recollected Malthus's principles of population. And he came up with the hypothesis or the theory or whatever, the principle of natural selection. He wrote, those organisms that are best adapted to their local surroundings are seen to have a better chance of surviving and thus of passing along their traits to progeny. Survival of the fittest, which is actually a phrase, if I'm not mistaken, initially used by Herbert Spencer. So the question is, who is the true father of evolution? Are there two fathers of evolution? Well, it's a question that I'm not prepared to answer. Certainly, I believe there were two fathers of evolution. And it's very interesting that despite the fact that Wallace killed so many orangutans, 17 of them, despite the fact that he skinned them, assembled their bones, so on and so forth, it really wasn't orangutans that seemed to have played much a role in, or a prominent role in his understanding of natural selection. But again, I'll say what I think, and I think that Wallace was a man of his time, very intelligent man, and like somebody, a previous speaker spoke about, one who conceived of many illuminating concepts. But yet in another sense, I get the feeling that Darwin was beyond time. I've read that people who read Darwin's papers continue, even now, to be highly impressed by what he wrote. Something like that is true of Wallace as well. Again, I'm not a specialist in British social classes. Somebody actually asked a question this morning about could Wallace's reticence, his modesty, be due to his station in life? And I would be inclined to agree with that, because I have been to Britain, I have been to England, and I've been in a number of situations where, I'll give you an example, I was sitting in a green room, waiting, for my turn to appear on the television show, and I asked the man sitting next to me, I said, "Are you an author?" He had written 7 books, right? I said, "Are you an author?" And he said, "Oh no," he said, "I'm just a writer. I'm barely a writer." And I encountered this kind of modesty that you would never encounter in the United States. Or Canada. You wouldn't encounter it in Canada, you wouldn't encounter it in Australia. And another example is John Mackinnon. John Mackinnon is a great naturalist. He studied orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra a few years before I did. And he was the person who discovered 2 new large mammal species unknown to Western science in Vietnam. And when I asked him about it, and I'm sure this will be his legacy, his enduring legacy, when I asked him about it, do you know what he said? He said, "I am only sorry, I so much regret that I found those 2 species and not some Vietnamese scientist." He regretted it. I mean, the kind of modesty, again, and humility that you simply virtually never encounter in the New World. So I'm quite convinced that part of Wallace's humility, part of Wallace's admiration and deep respect for Darwin came about because of how and where he was born. people tell me that if you're born in a certain class in Great Britain, now it's could all be changed, of course, but you never quite leave it behind you, especially if you're a man. That's what I've been told. I'm not an anthropologist in the study of the British social classes, but I want to emphasize that, because that's been my experience. John Mackinnon, Wallace, very, very similar kind of attitudes. Even though if you encounter John Mackinnon, he seems quite brash. So the Malay Archipelago is a great travel book. I second the motion that it's one of the greatest travel books written in the 19th century. I reread it. I read it years ago. And even though I was reading it for the second or third time, one of the things that struck me was how enjoyable it was, how vivid Wallace's descriptions were, and how true they were to what I myself have experienced in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then towards the end of his life, of course, Wallace became very interested in social issues. Again, this might have had something to do with his upbringing and the natural empathy that he felt for people and not necessarily animals, despite the care he took with the orangutan infant that he raised for 3 months. Sorry, I missed something here and I want to go back to it. Yeah. In his own eyes, Wallace considered himself very lazy. It's extraordinary for a man of his productivity. Like somebody said, he could have gotten tenure quite early in his career had he been living in a modern age. And of course, 100 years ago, he died, and the world lost one of the great naturalists in all history, probably. So, to answer the question, why are there no orangutans in Australia? We go back to the Wallace Line, and I think people talked about it in very illuminating terms. And the Wallace Line is a line that Wallace first noticed the existence of when he went to Lombok. And the islands of Bali and Lombok are actually separated by 19 nautical miles. And yet, the thing that struck Wallace and struck other people later was that the birds of Bali were totally different from the birds of Lombok. And, you know, the most obvious things are not necessarily obvious. It was like the poem or the rap that I think Richard did. Why didn't I see that? Well, the most obvious things are not necessarily obvious until you have the right search images. And this is one of the things that I've noticed, that my husband is a Dayak. He still belongs to the Aboriginal religion, which is Kaharingan. He was born in the forest, and he still lives in the forest. And he can see things that 15 Westerners pass by without taking a notice of. For instance, a poisonous snake. I remember being the head of a line of a group of volunteers. There were 15 of us. And we're walking by, my husband's in the back, and he says, "Stop, there's a poisonous snake here." And of course, everybody has their cameras, and they're all grouped around the snake, you know, and I'm saying, maybe you should move away, maybe you should away. You know, and that snake was literally 6 or 7 inches from the path that 15 Westerners walked by. We didn't see it because it was so absolutely still. So, probably hundreds of Westerners and others had seen the difference between the birds of Bali and the birds of Lombok, but didn't really recognize the obviousness of it. And again, other speakers have been quite eloquent in describing how Wallace's training as a surveyor had something to do with it. A description of the Wallace Line, and the mammals crossing the line, crossing from the Asian portion to the Australian portion, very few, 13 of 2 species of deer, but now they think that perhaps those deer were brought over by people. You can see that the crossing of the Wallace's line was not that common, and that line was not that permeable. Even though proboscis monkeys are excellent swimmers and have been encountered out of sight of land swimming in the South China Sea near Borneo. And the orangutans and gibbons have not crossed the Wallace Line. And I don't really need to talk too much about the origins of it, because the previous speaker, I think, explained it very well. But the point is that of the primate order, it's only tarsiers, who are tiny little things, macaques, who are very omnivorous and very opportunistic, and humans have crossed the line. And you could probably call humans the macaques of the primate order, of the great apes, of the hominines or the hominids, because they too are opportunistic and quite omnivorous. I wanted to talk a little bit about Wallacea. And the reason is because there's some misunderstanding of what the Wallace Line really is. Wallacea is the biographical designation for a group of Indonesian islands which are separated by deep water straits from the Asian and Australian continental shelves, which are called Sundaland, which consists of the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and Bali, and the near Oceania, which consists of Australia and New Guinea, which is also referred to as the Sahel. So if you'll notice that the Wallace Line actually cuts across Sulawesi. And this Wallacea is a very special place. It is the transitional area between the actual Asian species and the Australian species. So west of this area, you find mammals and birds that are similar to that of East Asia, while west of it, you find animals and birds that are very similar to those from Asia, and to the east of it, you find animals such as marsupials and birds that are similar to those of Australia. So the islands of Wallacea have very few land mammals, land birds, or freshwater fish of continental origin. So these are animals that find it difficult to cross open ocean. More birds, reptiles, and insects have crossed over. So Sulawesi, which is the big island in the center, right here, has many endemic species, and it also has Australian species that are definitely Australian in origin. So there are different other lines that have been proposed, such as the Weber line, and this is the midpoint between Asian and Australian flora and fauna, where they're approximately equally represented. And this line follows the deepest straits between in traversing the Malay Archipelago. So their primates have crossed Wallacea. Bats have obviously crossed it. Rodents have crossed it. Rodents are one of the few placental mammals native to Australia. But only one canine, the dingo, has crossed Wallacea, and again, probably with the help of people. So, again, trying to understand Wallace, trying to understand Darwin, we come to the importance of beetles. And again, some people who have spoken earlier have touched on this. Why did so many of the greatest intellects fail while Darwin and myself hit upon the solution of the problem? I believe in both early life, both Darwin and myself became ardent beetle hunters. And this is what Wallace himself concluded. So a quarter of all described species are beetles. And somebody already said that, mentioned prodigious numbers of specimens that Wallace collected, and a very large proportion of those were beetles. Darwin himself was an ardent beetle collector. This is one of his collections. And he even writes about his, I guess you could almost call obsession with collecting beetles, because he actually put one into his mouth, and it injected some intensely acrid fluid, and it burned his tongue. So he lost not only that one, but he lost the other one. So this is a very well-known quote. And in response to a question about what a lifetime of natural history collecting had taught him about the Creator, Haldane said he had an inordinate fondness for beetles. And I think that was also true of Wallace and Darwin. And he continued. He said, God, were he likely to exist, is most likely to take trouble over reproducing his own image, and his 400,000 attempts of the perfect beetle contrast with the slipshod creation of humans. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to mention that our main sponsor or institution that supports the work that I and others have done in central Indonesian Borneo is the Orangutan Foundation International. You can reach us at orangutan.org. I don't have a book to sell. I don't have an album. But I do want to mention our foundation. Thank you very much, and thank you for being so kind for giving me the extra time.